This is the story of the Waukesha 310, a diesel engine so rare that most people in the agricultural world have never even heard of it. Built in small numbers, used in a handful of tractors, and then largely forgotten, this engine has become one of the most sought-after pieces of machinery among collectors today. We're talking about an engine where finding a single surviving example is considered a major discovery. Along the way, we'll encounter the rise and fall of American agricultural manufacturing, the fierce competition between tractor companies, and the obsessive collectors who spend decades tracking down these mechanical ghosts. So let us begin. But first, what exactly was Waukesha, and why were they building diesel engines for tractors in the first place? The Waukesha Motor Company was founded in 1906 in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is about 20 miles west of Milwaukee. Now, if you don't know much about early 20th century American manufacturing, Wisconsin was absolutely central to the engine business. The state had skilled labor, access to raw materials, and a network of foundries and machine shops that made it ideal for building precision machinery. Waukesha started out making gasoline engines for a variety of applications, everything from boats to stationary power plants to early automobiles. They built a reputation for quality and reliability, which in those days was not something you could take for granted. I mention this because by the 1930s, when the diesel revolution was beginning to transform agriculture, Waukesha was perfectly positioned to be part of it. They had decades of engine-building experience, a solid engineering team, and relationships with major equipment manufacturers. The question was whether they could adapt their expertise to the new diesel technology that was sweeping through the farming world. Now, diesel engines were not exactly new by this point. Rudolf Diesel had patented his design back in 1893, and large diesel engines had been powering ships and industrial equipment for years. But putting a diesel engine in a tractor was a different challenge entirely. Farm equipment needed to be rugged, reliable, and relatively affordable. It needed to start in cold weather, run on whatever fuel was available, and survive the kind of abuse that farmers routinely inflicted on their machinery. Early diesel tractors were notoriously difficult to start, especially in winter, and many farmers remained skeptical of the technology well into the 1940s. This is where companies like Waukesha came in. They weren't building complete tractors themselves. Instead, they were supplying engines to tractor manufacturers who didn't have the capability or the desire to develop their own power plants. It was a common arrangement in those days. A tractor company would design the chassis, transmission, and implements, and then drop in an engine made by someone else. This allowed smaller tractor manufacturers to compete without the enormous investment required to develop a diesel engine from scratch. The Oliver Corporation was one of these companies. Oliver had been building farm equipment since 1855, originally as a plow manufacturer in South Bend, Indiana. By the 1930s, they had grown into a major player in the tractor market, but they were competing against giants like John Deere, International Harvester, and Case. Oliver was known for innovation and was actually ahead of many competitors in adopting new technologies. They introduced row crop tractors, streamlined styling, and were early adopters of diesel power. But here's the thing about Oliver. They didn't always build their own engines. For some of their diesel models, they turned to outside suppliers, and this is where Waukesha enters the story. The relationship between Oliver and Waukesha would produce some fascinating machines, including the extraordinarily rare 310 diesel. The Waukesha 310 was a 6-cylinder diesel engine with a displacement of approximately 310 cubic inches, which is where it got its name. Now, for an agricultural diesel of that era, this was a mid-sized engine, suitable for medium-duty tractors that needed to handle serious field work without being the massive, fuel-guzzling monsters used on the largest farms. The 3-10 was designed to be a workhorse, nothing flashy, just solid engineering meant to run for thousands of hours under tough conditions. What made the 310 special wasn't its technical specifications, which were fairly conventional for the time. What made it special was how few of them were ever made. We're talking about an engine that was produced in numbers so small that exact production figures are difficult to verify. Estimates suggest that only a few hundred 310 engines were ever built, and that's being generous. Some researchers believe the actual number might be even lower. Why so few? That's where the story gets interesting. The agricultural equipment industry in the 1940s and 1950s was going through massive consolidation. Smaller manufacturers were being squeezed out by the big players, and the ones that survived often did so by finding niches or by being absorbed into larger corporations. Oliver itself would eventually become part of White Motor Corporation in 1960, and the original Oliver identity would slowly disappear over the following decades. But in the years before that merger, Oliver was trying to compete on multiple fronts, and that meant experimenting with different engine suppliers and configurations. The Waukesha 310 was one of these experiments. It was used in a limited production run of Oliver tractors, but it never became a standard offering. There were several reasons for this. The engine was more expensive than some alternatives. The supply chain was complicated, and Oliver was simultaneously developing its own engine capabilities. The 310 was essentially a transitional product used during a period when Oliver was figuring out its long-term strategy. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into obscure machinery history, consider subscribing. It helps us reach more people who appreciate these forgotten stories. But anyway, back to the 310. The tractors that received the Waukesha 310 were primarily used in specific applications where the engine's characteristics made sense. Some went to farms that needed reliable mid-range power for row crop work. Others ended up in industrial applications because farm tractors of this era were often repurposed for light construction, municipal work, or factory yard duty. A sturdy diesel tractor was a versatile tool, and many survived long past their expected lifespan by being reassigned to different tasks. But here's what happened to most of them. They wore out. They broke down. They were scrapped for parts or simply abandoned in fence rows and equipment graveyards. By the 1970s, when the first generation of agricultural collectors started getting seriously interested in vintage tractors, the Waukesha 310 powered machines were already rare. By the 1990s, they were considered exceptional finds. Today, locating a surviving example with the original engine is the kind of discovery that makes collectors' hearts race. I want you to imagine what it's like to hunt for one of these machines. You start by joining collector organizations, the Oliver Collectors News, and similar groups that have been tracking these tractors for decades. You subscribe to newsletters. You attend swap meets and auctions. You talk to old farmers and equipment dealers who might remember seeing one of these engines 30 or 40 years ago. You follow leads that turn out to be dead ends. Someone's grandfather had one, but it was sold in the estate auction back in 1985, and nobody knows where it went. Another one was spotted in a barn in Iowa in the early 2000s, but when you track down the property, the barn has collapsed, and whatever was inside is buried under rotting timbers. This is the reality of collecting rare agricultural equipment. It's not like collecting cars, where you can check auction results and track known examples through a network of enthusiasts and dealers. With something like the Waukesha 310, you're dealing with machines that were never prestigious, never valuable enough to be carefully preserved, and never numerous enough to have a dedicated following until it was almost too late. The collectors who pursue these engines are a particular breed. They're not in it for investment potential or bragging rights, at least not primarily. They're driven by a genuine fascination with mechanical history and a determination to preserve something that would otherwise disappear entirely. Many of them are farmers or mechanics themselves, people who grew up around this kind of equipment and have the skills to restore machines that most people would consider beyond saving. Now, this is where it gets fascinating. The process of restoring a rare engine like the Waukesha 310 is completely different from restoring a common tractor. With a John Deere Model A or a Farmall H, you can buy reproduction parts from multiple suppliers. There are shop manuals readily available, online forums full of advice, and thousands of other restored examples to use as reference. With the 310, you're often working from scratch. Parts have to be fabricated or adapted from other engines. Gaskets have to be custom made. If the block is cracked, you need to find a skilled machinist who can repair it because there's no replacement sitting on a shelf somewhere. Original documentation is scarce, so restorers often have to reverse engineer systems based on what they can observe in the surviving engines. It's detective work as much as mechanical work. I mention this because the rarity of the 310 has created a small but dedicated community of experts who share information freely. Unlike some collector markets where knowledge is hoarded to maintain competitive advantage, the Waukesha 310 community is remarkably cooperative. When someone finds a surviving engine, the news spreads quickly. Other collectors offer advice, share photographs of their own restorations, and sometimes provide spare parts from their personal stockpiles. There's an understanding that every surviving 310 is precious, and that helping one owner succeed benefits everyone who cares about preserving these machines. The question of why anyone would go to such effort for an engine that was, frankly, not particularly distinguished in its time is worth considering. The 310 wasn't the most powerful engine of its era. It wasn't the most innovative. It wasn't particularly beautiful or elegant. It was a workmanlike diesel that did its job and was replaced by more modern designs within a few years. So why does it matter? This is where we get into the philosophy of preservation, which I find genuinely interesting. Some collectors focus on famous machines, the tractors that changed agriculture or represented technological breakthroughs. Others are drawn to rarity itself, the challenge of finding and preserving something that almost nobody else has. But I think the deepest motivation is something more personal. These engines represent a specific moment in time, a particular way of building things and solving problems that no longer exists. Every Waukesha 310 that survives is a physical artifact of 1940s American manufacturing, a three-dimensional document that tells you things about its era that no photograph or written record can convey. When you stand in front of one of these engines, you can see the casting marks from the foundry. You can see the tool marks left by the machinists who bored the cylinders. You can see the wear patterns that reveal how the engine was used, which components failed first, which ones held up, how farmers and mechanics improvised repairs over the decades. It's a kind of industrial archaeology, and for people who are attuned to it, there's nothing else quite like it. The geographic distribution of surviving 310 engines is itself a historical record. Most were originally sold in the Midwest, where Oliver had its strongest market presence, but tractors moved around over the years. Some followed their owners to new farms in the West. Others were sold at auction and ended up hundreds of miles from where they started. A few were exported to Canada or Mexico. Tracking these movements through ownership records, when they exist, tells you something about migration patterns, agricultural economics, and the used equipment market of the mid-20th century. Let me tell you about one particular discovery that illustrates how these finds typically happen. In the early 2000s, a collector in Minnesota received a tip about an old Oliver tractor that had been sitting in a machine shed for decades. The owner had died, and the family was cleaning out the property. Most of the equipment had already been sold or scrapped, but there was one tractor that nobody wanted because it didn't run, and nobody recognized the engine. When the collector arrived, he immediately knew what he was looking at. The engine was a Waukesha 310, dirty and seized, but remarkably complete. The tractor itself was in rough shape, but the engine was the real prize. He bought the whole machine for a few $100s, which even then was cheap for a running Oliver tractor and absurdly cheap for one with this particular engine. The restoration took 3 years. The collector had to source a rebuild kit from a supplier who specialized in obscure industrial diesels. He had to have a local machine shop fabricate several components that were simply unavailable. He consulted with 2 other collectors who had worked on 310 engines, comparing notes and photographs to make sure he was getting the details right. When the engine finally ran again, it was the first time it had operated in over 30 years. That tractor is now one of the best documented Waukesha 310 powered machines in existence. The collector has compiled a complete history of the engine, including correspondence with the original dealer who sold it new in 1948. He takes it to shows occasionally, where it draws a small but knowledgeable crowd of enthusiasts who understand what they're looking at. And what of the future? This is something that concerns the collector community. The generation that grew up with these machines, the people who remember seeing them work in the fields and who have the mechanical skills to restore them, is aging. Younger collectors tend to focus on more accessible machines, tractors with larger part supplies, and more extensive documentation. The specialized knowledge required to work on something like a Waukesha 310 is being lost as the old-timers pass away. There are efforts to preserve this knowledge. The collector organizations publish technical articles. Some enthusiasts have created detailed restoration guides that document every step of rebuilding these engines. A few have even produced video documentation of their restorations, creating a visual record that can supplement the written materials. But it's a race against time. The value of surviving 310 engines has increased significantly over the past 2 decades, which creates its own problems. Higher prices attract speculators who buy machines without any intention of restoring them, hoping to flip them for profit later. Some engines have been separated from their tractors and sold individually, which fragments the historical record. And the higher values make it harder for dedicated collectors with limited budgets to acquire machines that deserve proper restoration. I should mention that the Waukesha Motor Company itself had a long and interesting history beyond the 310 engine. They continued building industrial and marine diesels for decades, eventually being acquired by Dresser Industries in 1986 and later becoming part of GE's power generation business. The Waukesha name survives today on large gas engines used in power plants and pipeline compression stations, but the small agricultural diesels that first carried the company's name into the farming world are long gone from production. There's something poignant about that trajectory. A company starts out building small engines for practical applications, grows and evolves over the decades, and eventually becomes part of a multinational corporation building equipment that its founders could never have imagined. The original purpose, providing power for farms and small industry, becomes a footnote in the corporate history. But those early engines, the ones that survived through luck, and the devotion of collectors, remain as physical evidence of what the company once was. The Waukesha 310 was never famous. It was never the best at anything. It was simply a competent diesel engine that happened to be built in very small numbers at a transitional moment in agricultural history. And yet, precisely because of its obscurity, it has become something more than it ever was in its working life. It's become a symbol of impermanence, a reminder that even the most solid and practical things can slip away if nobody makes the effort to preserve them. The collectors who hunt for these engines, who spend years and thousands of dollars restoring them, who drive hours to look at a rusty hulk in a collapsed barn on the chance that it might be what they're looking for, these people are doing something genuinely important. They're maintaining a physical connection to a past that is otherwise accessible only through photographs and documents. They're keeping alive the skills and knowledge needed to maintain machines that most mechanics have never seen. And they're proving that something doesn't have to be famous or valuable to be worth saving. Every Waukesha 310 that still runs is a small victory against entropy. Every restoration is an act of recovery, bringing back something that was almost lost. The engines themselves are just metal and iron, but they carry with them the story of an era, a company, and the farms where they worked. As long as anyone remembers them, as long as anyone cares enough to keep them running, they remain present in a way that photographs and written records can never replicate. And what of the surviving examples? Best estimates suggest that perhaps 24 Waukesha 310 engines exist in recognizable form today. Of these, maybe half are in running condition or have been fully restored. The rest are projects, barn finds, partial engines, or parts donors for the machines that are being actively preserved. New discoveries still happen occasionally, usually when old properties change hands and the new owners investigate what's hiding in the outbuildings. Every such discovery adds to our knowledge and provides hope that more examples might still be out there, waiting. The collectors keep searching, they keep restoring, they keep sharing information and helping each other. They do it because they love these machines, because they value the history they represent, and because they know that once these engines are gone, they're gone forever. No museum will rebuild them. No manufacturer will produce replicas. The only Waukesha 310 engines that will exist in 50 years are the ones that survive today. Well, there we have it. The story of an engine that almost nobody remembers, built by a company that has largely been forgotten, installed in tractors that were scrapped by the thousands, and yet here we are, talking about it, because a handful of people decided it was worth preserving. That says something about human nature, I think. We're driven to save things, to remember things, to maintain connections to the past, even when there's no practical reason to do so. The Waukesha 310 is just an engine, but the effort to preserve it is about something larger. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one. This is the story of the Waukesha 310, a diesel engine so rare that most people in the agricultural world have never even heard of it.